Yo, it's your boy Logos, and today I want to react to another Thomas Sowell video. This time, the origins of Black American ghetto culture. And I say it over and over again on these uploads that I think the biggest, I don't know, hindrance to Black Americans isn't racism or anything else to talk about in MSNBC or even CNN. It's honestly our culture and the way we address each other, the values that we have, and the standards that we have. And oftentimes, that when somebody falls below the standard, that we all know is good for everybody involved, instead of saying like, I understand why you failed, but still try again to reach for it. Instead of doing that, we like to lower the bar. And a good like example I could think of that illustrates it is I think that girl Shakari Jackson, who was at I think track star a few years ago, who smoked weed and tested positive before the Olympics, I think. And a lot of Black Americans was upset about it. And I couldn't understand why you was upset because for one, Japan, I think that's the country where the Olympics was held during that time. Japan has strict drug policy. Second of all, she's an American. So the idea that you're going to dictate another country's laws and make an exception for her is ridiculous. And third, it's an international competition. Everybody else has to make sure they pass these drug tests. You can't make an exception for her. And fourth, come on, man. She knew what she was doing. She's a grown adult. She can make these decisions for herself. So when she does something good, praise her. When she does something bad, hold her accountable. Don't pick and choose when you want to decide to focus on her or not focus on her. When you want to decide to focus on her behavior or not when it's good for you, or you think it supports your agenda. That's just an example of just this culture making excuses for the way we are, or the stuff that we do. And I'm of the opinion that if we just stopped it, we'll be better off. Instead of making excuses for it, we're talking about racism all the time. Like today with the whole affirmative action thing with Supreme Court justices. I'm of the opinion that there's no reason Black kids can get into Harvard, can get into Harvard if they study hard, just like everybody else. You shouldn't lower the standards just to make Black Americans be able to enter, especially if you have Asians, whites, or anybody else with better scores, better educational attendance records than they do, but they can't get in or get scholarships because they're not Black. It just doesn't make sense to me. And then these Black kids get debt, and then oftentimes they drop out because the courses are too hard. You can't just flip the script when you go into a major university, especially Ivy League, one of the best universities on this planet. Come on, it just doesn't make sense to me. Let's watch this video from Thomas Sowell because I want to see his perspective on it.
These people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job, they flout the law constantly and neglect their children, they drink too much, and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. For some reason or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life. This was said in 1956 in Indianapolis, not about blacks or other minorities, but about poor whites from the South. Nor was Indianapolis unique in this respect. A 1951 survey in Detroit found that white Southerners living there were considered undesirable by 21% of those surveyed, compared to 13% who ranked blacks the same way. In the late 1940s, a Chicago employer said frankly, "I told the guard at the plant gate to tell the hillbillies that there were no openings." When poor whites from the South moved into northern cities to work in war plants during the Second World War, occasionally, a white Southerner would find that a flat or a furnished room had just been rented when the landlord heard his Southern accent. More is involved here than a mere parallel between blacks and Southern whites. What is involved is a common subculture that goes back for centuries, which has encompassed everything from ways of talking to attitudes toward education, violence, and sex, and which originated not in the South, but in those parts of the British Isles from which white Southerners came. That culture long ago died out where it originated in Britain, while surviving in the American South.
I just want to go back a little bit because I want to touch on those three things he talked about. And I don't want to forget, so let me just scroll back a little bit.
But in those parts of the British Isles from which white and which originated.
Yes, there it goes. Education, violence, and sex. Education. Growing up, myself and even Ram, he said that he heard, "Why you acting white?" Just because he did things like read books, he talked a certain way, and he didn't talk like weird or like he was above anybody. He just talked like somebody that was educated. Somebody that used words bigger than, 6, 7, 8 letters. He knew what he was talking about. But for some reason doing that, we was told we was acting right or talking right or this and the other. Through college educated black kids who go to school and come back after 6 months or a year or so to just visit family or come down for the holidays. That could be just a few months, honestly. And they'll hear the same stuff too. Why you talking like that? You think you better than us because you go to college and this and the other. Just very crab in the bucket type mentality and stuff to the people that you claim to care about, that you claim to want to do better. The violence. I mean, come on, that's just known. The gang violence, the glorification of it in the music. You can't have a conversation with people without them wanting to have to fight or shoot or this and the other. It's just ignorance. Sets. Like, come on. Broken homes, this and the other, single mothers, baby mamas, baby daddies, just, it just is what it is. And I'm not saying that in a way that nobody should care. I'm just saying, like, it's been this way for so long that you know what I'm talking about. I don't have to list out specific examples. We can see the results, whether you're black, white, or whatever. It's just there. And the whole point is to get better, is to have standards, not to just say, have fun, live free, live your best life. The attitude gets us where we are now. Instead of blaming ourselves or taking accountability, we'll blame the government or somebody else. Let's keep going.
To attitudes toward education, violence, and sex, and which originated not in the South, but in those parts of the British Isles from which white Southerners came. That culture long ago died out where it originated in Britain, while surviving in the American South. Then it largely died out among both white and black Southerners, while still surviving today in the poorest and worst of the urban black ghettos. It is not uncommon for a culture to survive longer where it is transplanted and to retain characteristics lost in its place of origin. The French spoken in Quebec and the Spanish spoken in Mexico contain words and phrases that have long since become archaic in France and Spain. Regional German dialects persisted among Germans living in the United States after those dialects had begun to die out in Germany itself. A scholar specializing in the history of the South has likewise noted among white Southerners archaic word forms, while another scholar has pointed out the continued use in that region of terms that were familiar at the time of the first Queen Elizabeth. The card game whist is today played almost exclusively by blacks, especially low-income blacks, though in the 18th century it was played by the British upper classes and has since then evolved into bridge. The history of the evolution of this game.
Is there another name for that game? Because I personally never heard of it. I've heard of games. I play games, like Tonk, Spade, so such and so forth, poker, but I never played a bridge or risk. I definitely never heard of risk. So if you know what that is, or there's like a more modern term for it, put it in the comments down below.
Game is indicative of a much broader pattern of cultural evolution in much more weighty things. Southern whites not only spoke the English language in very different ways from whites in other regions. Their churches, their roads, their homes, their music, their education, their food, and their sex lives were all sharply different from those of other whites. The history of this redneck or cracker culture is more than a curiosity. It has contemporary significance because of its influence on the economic and social evolution of vast numbers of people, millions of blacks and whites, and its continuing influence on the lives and deaths of a residual population in America's black ghettos, which has still not completely escaped from that culture. From early in American history, foreign visitors and domestic travelers alike were struck by cultural contrasts between the white population of the South and that of the rest of the country in general, and of New England in particular. In the early 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville contrasted white Southerners with white Northerners in his classic Democracy in America, and Frederick Law Olmsted did the same later in his books about his travels through the antebellum South, notably Cotton Kingdom. De Tocqueville set a pattern when he concluded that almost all the differences which may be noticed between the Americans in the southern and in the northern states have originated in slavery. Olmsted likewise attributed the differences between white Southerners and white Northerners to the existence of slavery in the South. So did widely read antebellum Southern writer Hinton Helper, who declared that slavery, and nothing but slavery, has retarded the progress and prosperity of our portion of the Union. Just as they explained regional differences between whites by slavery, So many others in a later era would explain differences between blacks and whites nationwide by slavery. Plausible as these explanations may seem in both cases, they will not stand up under a closer scrutiny of history. It is perhaps understandable that the great overwhelming moral curse of slavery has presented a tempting causal explanation of the peculiar subculture of Southern whites, as well as that of blacks. Yet this same subculture had existed among Southern whites and their ancestors in those parts of the British Isles from which they came, long before they had ever seen a black slave. The nature of this subculture, among people who were called rednecks and crackers in Britain before they ever saw America, needs to be explored before turning to the question of its current status among ghetto blacks and how developments in the larger society have affected its evolution.
I actually didn't know that cracker and redneck came from Britain. I do remember hearing those terms growing up because honestly, when people would throw like the N word, that would be like the reflex of like the opposite if it's like a white person. So I heard that word a lot growing up, and just to hear that it's coming from like Britain and it's like hundreds of years old, and it really is like before slavery, from my understanding, that's very interesting because from my understanding before, people were saying that it's because of slavery, because when you like rip somebody, the crack, and that's like a cracker, and that's how it got correlated to white people. That's how I heard it originally growing up. So to hear Thomas Sowell give a different reasoning, and that the word of it goes back even further, and that's how they addressed people before they even had slaves or came over to the United States. That's just more proof of Thomas Sowell dropping knowledge. I'll say it again. I don't think the problem with Black Americans is racism or somebody holding us back. Just lift up our standards and expect more of ourselves, and we'll get it. There's really no reason why a black kid in America can't go to Harvard. There's no reason why he can't study hard enough and understand the material. He's not inferior in any way. He can't be held back in any way. He is who he is. And if his family and his community will build up the idea of knowledge and learning is important in education, and then using your education to build up a life for yourself and future generations, instead of spending your money on Jordans or all this other bullshit we see on TV all the time. That's another thing too. I think it's very funny how we talk about building up black wealth or building up the black community or this and the other, but we love to spend our money on BS. Clothes, fake hair for women. For guys, it's like Jordans, they're trying to be flashy and stuff. I don't understand the mindset of trying to show the world how much money you supposedly have, but in reality, you really don't have that. You're just showing off a fake facade, but the only thing you're really portraying is, I don't know, you need people to accept you, and you're willing to pay and put yourself in debt to make that stuff happen. Like the credit card debt and all this other stuff, social media, and people need to post pictures all the time about their lifestyle, how much money they have. I just don't get it. Our culture worships money at this point, and I understand needing money to survive and to, I don't know, fuel your ambitions and your dreams and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, or at least from my understanding, what I've seen over the past few decades, it doesn't seem to be about that. It seems more to be about stunting on people. There's always a new term every few years about showing off in one way or another. Like you flossing, I think flossing is one. You were stunting on people when you were growing up. You what sunning people or something like that. Big bank, Teddy, little bank, stuff like that. It just kept repeating over and over growing up, and it's still going on. But we waste our money on BS. I don't always agree with Jay-Z on a lot of things, but that song he did when he said the story of OJ, and they were talking about like investments, and this is a way to like build up your wealth and not to do so by flash your money, flashing throwing dollar bills and stuff in strip clubs, like investments in art, investments in property, and seeing that wealth go up, and then being able to pass that down to your children. That stuff he said in that song, I absolutely support, and I wish people would listen to that more instead of NBA YoungBoy and bullshit. But that's just me. Maybe I'm just an old ass man at this point. It's your boy Logos, and I'll see you next time.